The wind howled like a hungry wolf through the cracks of Brokenstone Castle, a forgotten giant atop Cursed Hill. Thick moss covered the cold stones, and the echo of old Ilara's footsteps and those of his 7 orphaned grandchildren was the only melody in that desolate place. Expelled from the village by the cruel Lord Valerius, who mocked their misery and banished them to the ruins, they now faced the harsh winter with nothing but hope and a grandfather's promise. Ilara, with his artisan's calloused hands and a heart heavy with the loss of his wife, had vowed to care for the boys. Little Finn coughed incessantly, and the twins, Kyle and Liam, despite the biting cold, saw magical castles where there were only broken stones. Each day, they battled the cold that gnawed at their bones, the hunger that tightened their stomachs, and the scorn that burned their souls. But Ilara, a wise grandfather knowledgeable in ancient legends, felt that Brokenstone Castle held more than just ruins. It held a secret, a seed of hope planted in the heart of those ancient stones, waiting for the right moment to bloom. The cold cut through their skin like 1,000 invisible blades within the ruins of Brokenstone Castle. Every breath was a cloud of vapor that dissipated into the icy air, and each cough from Finn, weaker by the day, was a blow to Ilara's already heavy heart. The twins, Kale and Liam, once full of stories of knights and dragons, now huddled together, their eyes fixed on their grandfather's empty hands. Hunger gnawed, and the little firewood they had barely warmed a small corner of that immense and desolate fortress. Ilara, with his white hair and beard tangled by time and sorrow, felt the weight of each of his 7 orphaned grandchildren on his tired shoulders. He had promised to care for them, but the promise seemed to slip away with each passing day, without food, without warmth, without hope. Night brought not only more intense cold, but also the certainty that they could not survive much longer. Finn's tiny body trembled uncontrollably, and fever burned his pale skin. Ilara watched his grandson, his heart aching with a pain that surpassed the cold itself. There was no choice left. He had to go out, had to find something, anything, that could save his boys. The village was out of the question. Lord Valerius's cruelty was an insurmountable barrier. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was something beyond, in the wild, forgotten lands surrounding the castle. With the first grey light of dawn, Ilara wrapped himself in his oldest patched cloak. The farewell to his grandchildren was silent, full of glances that spoke more than 1,000 words. The implicit promise that he would return, that he would bring hope, hung in the icy air. He walked out of the ruins, the wind howling in his ears, transforming the landscape into a grey and white blur. The snow fell finely, yet relentlessly, covering the trails and making each step a battle. His feet, accustomed to an artisan's toil, now suffered from the uneven terrain and treacherous ice. Hours dragged on, and Ilara felt the cold penetrate his bones, hunger gnawing at his stomach. Despair began to set in, a dense fog that threatened to suffocate the last flame of his will. It was then, in the midst of a desolate clearing where twisted trees looked like frozen ghosts, that he saw her, a slender figure fallen in the snow, her body covered by a dark, torn cloak. At first, Ilara hesitated. Legends of forest creatures and winter dangers were many, but the sight of the figure's fragility, the way she seemed to surrender to the cold, stirred something in his weary heart. It was the same fragility he saw in his grandchildren. Approaching cautiously, Ilara realized it was a woman, old and wrinkled, with hair as white as the surrounding snow. Her lips were blue, and she trembled violently. Without a second thought, Ilara, with his calloused hands, lifted her with difficulty. The warmth of his own body, however scarce, was all he could offer. He carried her beneath a more sheltered tree, rubbing her arms and legs, trying to revive her. The woman slowly opened her eyes, a pair of deep blue orbs that seemed to see through Ilara's soul. "A pure heart in such a cold world," she whispered. her voice hoarse like the rustling of dry leaves. "You saved me, old Elara, and for that I will be eternally grateful." Elara was surprised she knew his name, but before he could ask, the woman extended her hand. In her wrinkled palm lay a small seed. It was no bigger than his thumbnail, a vibrant emerald green, seeming to pulse with its own light, even under the cloudy sky. "This is no ordinary seed," she said, her eyes fixed on Elara's. "It is the seed of hope, planted with ancient magic. Take it back to your home, to the heart of the ruins where despair nests. Plant it at midnight under the moonlight, and the magic will do the rest. But remember, hope must be watered with faith, and faith with the purity of your heart. Do not doubt what you will see." Elara took the seed. It was strangely warm to the touch, and a subtle energy seemed to vibrate in his hand. The woman, whom he now realized was a witch, one of those legendary figures from the tales of his youth, smiled faintly. "Go now, Elara. Your boys need you, and this seed, it is the answer." Before Elara could thank her or ask more, the witch closed her eyes and, in a blink, her body seemed to dissolve into the snow, leaving only the trace of a faint emerald glow that soon faded. Elara stood there alone again, the magic seed clutched in his hand. The cold seemed less intense, the hunger a little more bearable. The way back to Broken Stone Castle was traversed with a new urgency, a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Upon his arrival, his grandchildren awaited him, their eyes wide with relief and expectation. He had no food, no medicine, but he had something more, something the witch had called hope. He showed the seed to the boys, telling them the story of the encounter in the forest. Kyle and Liam's eyes shone with the ancient magic they so loved. Finn, even weak, extended a pale little hand to touch the seed, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. Elara knew it was a gamble, perhaps their last. But the witch's promise, the warm sensation of the seed in his hand, and his grandchildren's desperation compelled him to act. He would wait for midnight, for the moonlight, and plant the seed. Broken Stone Castle, a tomb of dreams, might be about to become something more. Night dragged on, colder and more relentless than any other Elara and his grandchildren had faced in the ruins of Broken Stone Castle. Each minute was an eternity, each gust of wind, an icy lament that seemed to penetrate to the soul. The small emerald seed, now resting on a smooth, cold stone in the center of the dying fire, was the only source of warmth, not physical, but of a faint hope that refused to die. The boys' eyes, once full of despair, now flickered between their grandfather and the small green jewel. Kyle and Liam, the dreaming twins, whispered to each other about the magic the witch had promised, their voices thin and trembling in the icy air. Finn, the weakest, was nestled in Elara's arms, his breath shallow and irregular, a constant reminder of the urgency of the moment. The grandfather felt the feverish warmth of his grandson's body, and with each weak cough, a knot of anxiety tightened in his chest. The seed was their last chance, their last prayer. Elara watched the sky through the cracks of the ruined castle. The stars glittered with cruel intensity, like diamonds embedded in black velvet, but the moon still hid, shyly, behind heavy clouds. The weight was excruciating. With every shadow dancing on the mossy walls, Elara's heart leaped. He wondered if the witch was real, if the seed was more than a cruel illusion. Hunger and cold were masters of doubt, whispering lies into his tired mind. But then he looked at the pale faces of his grandchildren, at the silent faith in their eyes, and the flame of hope rekindled. Lie, a silvery sliver appeared between the clouds. The moon, full and majestic, began to peek out, casting its cold, ethereal light over the ruins. The air seemed to vibrate with a subtle energy. Elara felt a shiver run down his spine, but it wasn't from cold. It was the feeling of something grand about to happen. With steady hands, despite his inner tremor, Ilara stood up, carrying Finn with one arm and the seed with the other. The other boys followed him in silence, their eyes wide, fear and expectation mixed in their childlike expressions. Ilara searched for the perfect spot, a patch of unfrozen earth, sheltered by a collapsed wall where the moonlight fell directly. It was a point in the heart of the ruins, where despair had rooted itself most deeply. He knelt, the cold earth penetrating his knees, but he didn't feel it. With a sharpened piece of wood, he dug a small hole, the earth damp and dark. The moonlight bathed his hands as he placed the emerald seed in the soil. It was an act of pure faith, a silent cry against adversity. With his fingertips, he covered the seed with earth, and then, with a final glance at the moon, he whispered an ancient prayer, one his own grandmother had taught him. Nothing happened. The silence that followed was heavier than the castle stones. The wind continued to howl, the ruins remained ruins, and the seed, now hidden beneath the earth, seemed to have taken with it the last spark of hope. Ilara's shoulders slumped. The boys huddled together, disappointment etched on their faces. Finn coughed again, a weak sound that broke the silence. Had the witch lied? Had he been foolish to believe? Ilara hugged Finn tighter, feeling the weight of failure. He sat down again near the almost extinguished fire, his heart heavy as lead. The night continued, and sleep, even the most restless, seemed impossible. Hours dragged on, marked only by the creaking of the trees outside and the intensifying cold. It was then that Kale, the more observant twin, pointed a trembling finger at the spot where the seed had been planted. "Grandpa! Look!" Ilara raised his eyes, tired and hopeless. But what he saw made him gasp. An emerald light, faint at first, pulsed softly from the ground. It wasn't a reflection of the moon, but a light of its own that seemed to breathe. The earth around that spot began to tremble, almost imperceptibly. A low sound, like a deep murmur coming from the bowels of the earth, began to echo through the ruins. The emerald glow intensified, and the murmur transformed into a hum, a vibration Ilara felt in his bones. The castle stones, once still and silent, began to groan. Fine cracks appeared in the walls, not from collapse, but as if something was expanding from within. The ground beneath their feet trembled harder, and the boys clung to Ilara, their eyes wide with fear and fascination. Suddenly, with a dry crack that echoed like thunder, the earth where the seed was planted burst open. A sprout, not an ordinary sprout, but a thick, twisted trunk, erupted from the soil with terrifying speed. It expanded and branched before their eyes, growing not upwards but outwards, engulfing the ruins, embracing the broken stones. The emerald light exploded in a dazzling brilliance, and the sound of wood and stone molding filled the air. Broken Stone Castle was not collapsing, it was transforming. Ancient walls were swallowed by new structures, polished woods and smooth stones appearing from nowhere, as if time was being reversed, or rather rewritten. Towers rose where only rubble had been. Stained glass windows appeared where the wind had howled freely. The cold receded, replaced by a soft, welcoming warmth emanating from the growing structure itself. The boys, previously frightened, now watched in reverent silence. Their fears dissipated before that impossible sight. Finn, in his arms, stopped coughing. His eyes, once lifeless, now sparkled with childlike wonder, fixed on the unfolding marvel. The castle, which had been a tomb, was being reborn, not as ruins, but as something new, something alive, something magical. The witch's promise was not a lie. It was a truth rising before them, stone by stone, beam by beam, under the moonlight that now bathed a gigantic mansion, still growing, molding itself, becoming real. The spectacle of transformation was breathtaking, a silent symphony of magic and matter. Brokenstone Castle, which for generations had been a monument to decay and oblivion, now twisted and expanded, not in agony, but in a glorious rebirth. The emerald glow emanating from the soil where the seed had been planted pulsed with an almost painful intensity, lighting up the night like a beacon of hope. The ruins, once stone skeletons, were swallowed by a torrent of life. Smooth, polished walls of light marble appeared from nowhere, rising with impossible speed. Dark wooden beams, carved with patterns that seemed both ancient and new, intertwined, forming high ceilings and majestic arches. Towers rose towards the moon, their battlements finely sculpted, and stained glass windows, which had not existed before, now shimmered with the internal light that began to emerge. The sound was that of an impossible construction orchestra, the click of stones fitting perfectly, the rustle of wood molding, the gentle hum of magic that seemed to infuse every new element. The relentless cold of the night receded, replaced by a soft, comforting warmth emanating from the growing structure itself, as if the mansion were alive, breathing warmth into its inhabitants. Ilara, still holding Finn, watched with a mixture of awe and disbelief. His eyes, accustomed to darkness and desolation, could barely process the grandeur unfolding. The boys, previously frightened, were now in a state of silent reverence. Kyle and Liam, the twins, pointed at the new towers, their pale faces illuminated by the emerald glow, whispering words of astonishment. And Finn, little Finn, who moments before seemed on the verge of death, now had wide eyes, a faint and genuine smile appearing on his lips, weariness and fever momentarily forgotten before that marvel. He no longer coughed. The transformation lasted what seemed like an eternity, but was, in fact, only a few minutes. The emerald glow reached its peak, dazzling everything around, and then, as quickly as it appeared, began to diminish. The hum of magic quieted, the sound of construction ceased. When the light fully dissipated, what remained was not the ruins, but a gigantic, imposing, and majestic mansion, standing where only rubble had been before. It was a castle, yes, but unlike any Ilara had ever seen or heard of. It wasn't dark and gothic, but elegant and inviting, with light stone walls, dark slate roofs, and countless windows that now glowed with a warm, golden light from within. A vast, solid wooden gate, adorned with intricate carvings, stood open, revealing a well-kept inner courtyard and a main door that seemed to beckon them. The air around the mansion was different. There was no longer the smell of mold and decay, but a fresh aroma of new wood, damp earth, and perhaps flowers. Ilara felt a tear roll down his face, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming emotion he couldn't name. It was relief, gratitude, and a hint of fear of the unknown. "Grandpa, is it real?" Kyle whispered, his voice choked. Ilara didn't answer with words, but with a nod. He pressed Finn against him, feeling the warmth of the small body, and began to walk towards the main door. Each step was an act of faith. The ground beneath their feet was no longer frozen and uneven, but a path of smooth stones leading to the entrance. As they approached, the golden light emanating from the windows intensified, and an even more intense wave of warmth enveloped them. The main door, made of dark oak and adorned with polished bronze fittings, seemed to invite them in. Ilara hesitated for a moment, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the smooth surface of the wood. It was warm to the touch, not the heat of fire, but the warmth of life. He pushed the door, which opened effortlessly, revealing a hall that was, to his tired eyes, the very definition of luxury and comfort. The floor was polished marble, reflecting the light from a huge crystal chandelier that hung from the high ceiling. A grand staircase with carved wooden banisters spiraled up to the upper floors. Lit fireplaces crackled in wall niches, radiating a delicious warmth that made months of cold seem like a distant nightmare. Soft, thick carpets covered the floor, and the air was perfumed with something sweet and comforting. There was no dust, no cobwebs, no smell of abandonment that permeated the ruins. Everything was new, clean, impeccable, and furnished. Velvet sofas, polished wooden tables, vases with fresh flowers. Everything was there, as if the mansion had been waiting for them. The boys entered, their steps hesitant at first, then firmer, their eyes scanning every detail with admiration. Liam ran to touch one of the sofas, sinking his fingers into the soft fabric. "Grandpa, it's so soft!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with a joy Ilara hadn't heard in a long time. But Ilara's priority was Finn. He felt his grandson's body relax in his arms, the warmth of the mansion seeming to soothe his breathing. He looked for a place where he could lay him down. And as if the mansion knew his needs, a door opened softly at the end of the corridor, revealing a room. It was a children's room, with walls painted in soft tones, a lit fireplace, and a large, soft bed, covered with warm blankets and fluffy pillows. Ilara walked over, gently placing Finn on the bed. The boy sighed, a sound of pure contentment, and snuggled into the blankets, a sleepy smile on his face. His skin, previously pale and feverish, now seemed less grey. Ilara sat on the edge of the bed, watching his grandson. The witch's magic had not only built a house, it had brought back hope, and perhaps health. The other boys gathered at the door, watching Finn, their own faces reflecting relief. There were still many questions, many mysteries. Who was that witch? Why had she helped them? And what did it mean to have a mansion that appeared from nowhere? But for now there was warmth, security, and the promise of a new beginning. The tension of immediate survival had lessened, replaced by a new and strange sense of peace. But magic, Ilara knew, always came with a price, or perhaps with a purpose. And he was about to discover what it was. Finn's breathing, once a harsh and painful sound, was now soft and rhythmic. His small lips curved into a dreamy smile, and Ilara felt a knot in his throat loosen. The warmth of the fireplace in the children's room enveloped the boy like a hug, dissipating the cold that had pursued him for so long. Ilara sat on the edge of the bed, his wrinkled hand caressing his grandson's sweaty hair. For a brief moment, the exhaustion and despair of months were replaced by a fragile, almost unreal peace. But Ilara's mind could not afford to rest completely. The mansion, with its grandeur and welcoming silence, was a miracle, yes, but a miracle that defied all logic and his life's experience. The witch. Her words echoed in Ilara's memory. A seed of hope. For a new beginning. But hope, he knew, often came with a price. And he still didn't know what the price of this impossible gift was. The other boys, Cale, Liam, and the younger ones, had moved away from Finn's bedroom door, drawn by the promise of exploration. Their muffled whispers and laughter came from the hall, a sound of pure joy Ilara hadn't heard in a long time. He stood up, feeling his body protest, but the need to check on the others was stronger. As he left the room, the smell of new wood and fresh flowers was even more pronounced, mingling with the subtle aroma of something delicious, something that smelled like food. "Boys!" Ilara called, his voice hoarse. "Don't stray too far." They appeared at the base of the grand staircase, their eyes wide, their faces lit up. Liam pointed at the crystal chandelier, which sparkled with thousands of golden reflections. Kyle tried to reach one of the carved wooden banisters, marveling at the smoothness of the finish. "Grandpa, it's like a real castle," Kyle exclaimed, his voice full of admiration. "It even has carpets that don't make noise." Ilara smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "Yes, it is, but we need to eat and drink. Is anyone hungry?" The mention of food made the boys' stomachs rumble in unison, an abrupt reminder of the hunger that had accompanied them for days. Ilara also felt the familiar pang in his own stomach. Where would there be a kitchen or food? The mansion had appeared from nowhere, furnished. Was it possible it also had food? He began to walk through the hall, following the inviting aroma. A door at the end of a corridor opened silently as he approached, revealing a kitchen that was the antithesis of everything they had known. It wasn't a rustic, cold kitchen, but a spacious, luminous room with polished marble countertops, dark wooden cabinets, and gleaming copper utensils hanging. A stone fireplace, larger than the others, crackled softly, and on a solid oak table in the center of the room there was a profusion of food. Fresh, golden loaves of bread, sliced cheese, fruits that looked as if they'd been picked that morning, a pitcher of creamy milk, and another of crystal-clear water. There was even a platter of roasted meat, still warm, exuding an aroma that made Ilara's mouth water uncontrollably. No one was there. The food simply sat there as if conjured. The boys, who followed him closely, burst into exclamations of joy. "Food!" Liam cried, running to the table. "Look, Grandpa, there are apples!" Ilara approached the table, hesitating for a moment. Was it safe? Was it real? Was the witch's magic so powerful it could create food from nothing? He picked up a piece of bread, feeling its warmth and soft texture. The smell was intoxicating. He took a bite. The taste was divine. The best bread he had ever tasted in his life. "It's real," he murmured, more to himself than to the boys. "Eat, my children. Eat your fill." They needed no further encouragement. The boys sat in the chairs around the table, devouring the food with a voracity Ilara understood well. He himself took a piece of meat and a glass of milk. Each sip, each bite, was an explosion of flavor and a sensation of nourishment his hungry body craved. The warmth of the food spread through his veins, and the tension that kept him on high alert began to ease just a little. As he watched his grandchildren eat, their dirty faces now lit by satisfaction, Ilara felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost overwhelmed him. The witch, whoever she was, had saved their lives. She had given them not only a roof but comfort, warmth and food, but gratitude was tempered by a persistent pang of apprehension. The mansion's perfection, the ease with which their needs were met, the absence of any explanation, all of it was unsettling. Magic was a powerful and unpredictable force. What would it demand in return? The witch had asked for nothing, set no conditions. That in itself was the most frightening. He looked at the kitchen windows, which overlooked the inner courtyard. The moon was still high, bathing the mansion in a silvery light. The structure was immense, much larger than it appeared from the outside. How many rooms, how many corridors, how many secrets did it hold? They were safe, yes, but they were also trapped within a mystery. The silence of the house, once the sounds of chewing subsided, was almost oppressive. There was no howling wind through cracks, no creaking of old wood, no rustling of nocturnal creatures. Only the gentle crackle of the fireplaces and the sound of their own breaths. It was a silence that seemed to wait, to observe. Ilara remembered an old legend his grandmother used to tell about houses that appeared from nowhere and had a will of their own. Houses that sheltered, but could also trap. He shook his head, trying to push away the dark thoughts. For now, they were safe. For now, Finn was breathing. For now, his children were eating. But the question persisted, an unsettling whisper in the back of his mind. What did the magic want from them? And when would the bill come due? The tension of immediate survival had been replaced by a new and more subtle anxiety. They had entered a world of wonders, but also of uncertainties. And the journey, Ilara knew, was only just beginning. Night advanced, and exhaustion finally began to take its toll on Ilara. He watched the boys, one by one, succumb to sleep, their heads falling onto the table or nestling into each other. The abundance of food, the warmth, the security, all were a balm for their exhausted bodies. Carefully, Ilara carried them, one by one, back to the children's room where Finn slept soundly. The mansion seemed to anticipate his needs, for upon entering, he noticed that more beds had appeared, soft and inviting, arranged around the room as if waiting for them. He laid each of his grandchildren down, covering them with the warm blankets. He observed their sleeping faces, the dirt and paleness of before replaced by a healthier color, a semblance of peace. It was a miracle, yes, but a miracle that weighed on his soul. The silence of the house, once welcoming, now seemed to have a different depth, almost a consciousness. Ilara felt observed, not by eyes, but by a diffuse presence that permeated the walls, the air, the very furniture. He stepped away from the room, leaving the boys to sleep. The hall was bathed in a soft light, and the crystal chandelier glittered like a private galaxy. Ilara walked slowly, his footsteps echoing only in his own mind. He tried to open a random door, but it remained closed, as if it wasn't the right moment. He tried another, and it opened softly, revealing a library with shelves full of ancient books and a smell of paper and leather. The mansion was not just a shelter. It was a being with its own rules, its own will. His grandmother's legend returned forcefully. Houses that chose their inhabitants, that protected them, but also molded them for an unknown purpose. Ilara felt like a pawn in a game he barely understood. The witch had asked for nothing, but perhaps the mansion itself was the demand. What did it want from them? What did it expect? He approached one of the grand hall windows, looking out into the darkness. The moon still illuminated the ruins that had once been their home. Now, a somber and desolate contrast to the mansion's grandeur. There was no way back. They were here, inside this magical and terrifying gift. Safety was an illusion if it came with invisible chains. Ilara felt a shiver run down his spine, despite the warmth of the fireplaces. The mansion was a paradise, but a paradise that seemed to have a soul that now enveloped them, fed them, and perhaps possessed them. The question, when would the bill come due, transformed into, what is the bill? And the answer, he feared, would be much more complex and profound than anything he could imagine. The journey to understand the price of magic was only just beginning, and Ilara knew he would need all his strength and wisdom to protect his grandchildren from whatever the mansion demanded. The early morning hours dragged on, dense and silent, as Ilara moved like a restless shadow through the mansion's corridors. Sleep, for him, was a luxury his troubled mind could not afford. Each step was an echo in the vastness of the house, a reminder of his solitude and the immense responsibility he carried. The mansion, with its imposing beauty, seemed to breathe around him, the fireplaces crackling at a soft rhythm, shadows dancing on the walls like whispered secrets. It was not an empty silence, but a full silence, laden with a presence Ilara felt in every fiber of his being. He needed to understand. He needed to find a way out, an explanation, anything that could unravel the mystery surrounding them. His feet led him back to the main hall, where the moonlight silvered the marble floor. There were several doors there, some he had already tried, others not. With renewed determination, Ilara began to test them one by one. The first door, richly carved, yielded under his hand, revealing a dazzling ballroom with floor-to-ceiling mirrors and a gleaming grand piano. It was not an exit. The next, simpler, opened into a formal dining room with a long table set for a banquet that would never happen. Ilara felt a knot in his throat. The mansion was not just a shelter. It was a labyrinth of wonders, each a distraction, an invitation to forget the outside world. He continued, feeling the urgency grow within him. There was a large door at the end of the main corridor that seemed to lead outside. It was heavy, solid oak, with wrought iron fittings. Ilara pushed it, expecting to feel the cold night air, the smell of earth, freedom. But the door didn't budge. He tried again with more force, his exhausted body protesting. Nothing. The door remained immobile, as if fused to the wall. There was no visible lock, no latch. It was simply closed, impenetrable. An icy shiver ran down his spine. The mansion wasn't just sheltering them, it was trapping them. His grandmother's legend echoed in his mind, clearer and more terrifying than ever. Houses that choose their inhabitants, that protect them, but also mold them for an unknown purpose. What did the mansion want? What was it molding them into? His grandchildren were safe, fed, warm, but at what cost? Was freedom the price? Ilara backed away from the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the hall windows, the same ones that overlooked the ruins outside. They were large, clear glass, but they seemed more like a painting than a passage to the real world. He approached one of them, trying to open it, but the window was also sealed, without a handle, without a crack. The image of the ruins, once a reminder of his loss, now seemed a mirror of his new prison. Safety, comfort, abundance. All were an illusion if they came with invisible chains. They had traded hunger and cold for a gilded cage. The witch had asked for nothing, but the mansion, in itself, was the demand. It had rescued them from the world, but for what destiny? Ilara felt an overwhelming weight in his chest. His grandchildren were sleeping, oblivious to the dark truth that was beginning to reveal itself. How could he protect them from something he couldn't see, couldn't touch, but felt in every fiber of that house? The mansion was a being, yes, but a being that now enveloped them, fed them, possessed them. The question, "What is the bill?" transformed into a silent cry of despair. And the answer, he feared, would be the very essence of their lives. The journey to understand the price of magic was not just beginning. It had become a fight for his family's very soul. And Ilara knew he would need all his strength and wisdom to face whatever the mansion demanded before it was too late. The early morning deepened, and with it the certainty that the miracle was, in fact, a dangerous enigma. With his nerves frayed, Ilara remembered the library he had discovered. Perhaps there, among the dusty volumes, there would be a clue, some ancient story, a cautionary tale that could illuminate the darkness of his situation. He returned to the hall, and, with a hesitant touch, the library door opened again, inviting and silent. The smell of old paper and aged leather filled the air, a momentary balm for his tormented mind. The shelves rose to the ceiling, filled with books of all sizes and colors, some with worn spines, others with gold titles that glimmered faintly in the ambient light. Ilara began to scan the shelves, his fingers brushing the volumes, looking for something that seemed out of the ordinary, something that didn't belong in a common library. He ignored the novels and philosophical treatises, focusing on the dustier corners, the sections that seemed less touched. The mansion seemed to watch him, shadows dancing in his wake, the silence filled with an almost palpable expectation. Suddenly, his eyes fell upon a book that stood out. It was small, bound in dark, unadorned leather, with no visible title on the spine. It looked ancient, older than the others, and emanated a strange aura, almost a subtle hum that Ilara felt in his fingers as he touched it. With a tremor, he pulled it from the shelf. The book was heavy, and the leather was worn but intact. As he opened it, a smell of damp earth and dried herbs rose to his nose. The yellowed and fragile pages were filled not with continuous text, but with strange symbols, intricate drawings of trees with deep roots and branches reaching for the stars, and fragments of writing in a language Ilara didn't recognize. However, some words, scattered and isolated, seemed familiar, as if they had been translated or transcribed somehow. Seed, home, pact, essence, harvest. His heart pounded. Harvest. The word resonated in his mind, cold and threatening. Ilara flipped through the pages with more urgency, the mansion's soft light seeming to dim, shadows lengthening. He found a sequence of drawings that seemed to tell a story. A seed planted, a house growing, human figures entering it, and then more disturbing images. The human figures seemed to merge with the house, their forms becoming part of the walls, the trees, the very soil. On one particularly unsettling page, there was a drawing of a house with roots extending downwards, and in place of the roots, there were shapes resembling human hearts pulsing with a faint light. His grandmother's legend returned with terrifying clarity. Houses that choose their inhabitants, that protect them, but also mold them for an unknown purpose. The purpose, Ilara now feared, was to be the very life source of the mansion. The harvest was not of grains or fruits, but of something far more intimate and vital. The mansion was not just sheltering them, it was consuming them. The witch had asked for nothing, because the mansion in itself was the demand. It had rescued them from the world, but for what destiny? To become part of it? To feed its magical existence? Ilara felt a cold panic rise in his throat. His grandchildren, they were sleeping, safe in their soft beds, but at what cost? The mansion was feeding them, yes, but perhaps it was to fatten them for the harvest. Safety was an illusion if it came with invisible chains that tightened with each passing day, each meal, each moment of comfort. The book seemed to vibrate in his hands, as if the mansion itself was whispering its darkest secrets. The journey to understand the price of magic had become a race against time, a desperate struggle to unravel the mansion's mysteries before it claimed its final harvest. Ilara closed the book abruptly, the sound echoing in the silent library. He needed a plan. He needed to protect his grandchildren, even if it meant fighting against the very house that had saved them. The book, now a heavy burden in his hands, seemed to burn. The truth, cold and brutal, had revealed itself in the yellowed pages, in every intricate symbol, in every disturbing drawing. It was not a shelter, but a trap. It was not a miracle, but a diabolical pact. The magic seed had not sprouted into a house, but into a gigantic parasite, fed by the vital essence of its inhabitants. The harvest was not a metaphor, it was the most literal and terrifying of realities. His grandchildren, his 7 little treasures, were being prepared to become the sustenance of that architectural abomination. The panic, previously a shiver, was now a silent scream, tearing at his throat, an icy terror spreading through every fiber of his being. How could he have been so blind? Hunger, cold, despair had clouded his judgment, making him vulnerable to the promise of comfort. And now, comfort was the bait, the sweetness that masked the poison. He thought of his grandchildren's sleeping faces, the innocent joy with which they had explored every corner of the mansion, the smiles that abundance had brought. That sight, once a balm for his soul, was now torture. They were happy, yes, but it was the happiness of a lamb in the pasture, oblivious to the fate that awaited it. Guilt crushed him, an unbearable weight. He had led them to safety, only to deliver them to a predator far more insidious than the streets. Ilara clutched the book to his chest, as if he could crush the truth within it. He needed a plan, but his mind was in a whirlwind. Fight a house? How do you fight something that breathes, that feels, that feeds on you? The mansion seemed to laugh at him, a silent laugh that echoed in the walls, in the dancing shadows. The smell of earth and herbs from the book seemed to spread, mingling with the scent of wax and flowers in the house, creating an oppressive atmosphere. He felt the mansion's presence stronger than ever, an ancient, hungry consciousness that enveloped him, probing him, like a predator playing with its prey. With his heart pounding erratically, Ilara stood up. He couldn't stay still. He couldn't accept it. His eyes swept across the library, searching for something, anything that could offer an escape. The windows sealed, the doors impenetrable. The house was a fortress, but a fortress that rose from within. He remembered the main door, the solid oak one, which wouldn't move, and the hall windows, which showed the outside world like a distant painting. Was there any weakness, any crack in the armor of that creature of stone and wood? He needed to find the mansion's heart, not the metaphorical heart, but the point from which it drew its strength, the place where the magic seed had been planted, the ruins. That was the place where the seed had been planted. If the mansion was a living being, its roots must be there, in the earth among the debris of the past. Perhaps if he could reach the roots, he could cut them, weaken the mansion, or even destroy it. But how to get there? The house was sealed. He returned to the hall, his footsteps echoing on the cold marble. The moonlight, once silver and magical, now seemed like a spotlight exposing the cruelty of the situation, revealing the deceptive beauty of that gilded prison. The main door seemed even more imposing, more unshakable, a silent guardian of his captivity. As Ilara approached the door, a soft melody began to float through the air. It was a delicate sound, almost a whisper coming from the ballroom. The grand piano, which he had seen earlier, seemed to play by itself, a sweet and hypnotic lullaby. It was a melody his grandchildren adored, one Ilara himself used to soothe them. The mansion was trying to distract him, to seduce him, or perhaps even to calm him, like a mother rocking a child to eternal sleep. The melody was an invitation to forget, to surrender to comfort, to accept his fate. But Ilara couldn't. The image of hearts pulsing like roots was etched in his mind, more vivid than ever. He resisted the urge to go there, to let himself be carried away by the music. The mansion was not just a structure, it was an entity with its own will, capable of manipulating, of seducing. It not only trapped physically, but tried to trap the mind, the spirit. It was a prison that offered dreams so that reality would become unbearable. Ilara realized that the fight would not only be against the walls, but against the very temptation of comfort, against the illusion of security the mansion offered. His grandchildren were being lulled by this illusion. He needed to get them out, whatever the cost, before the illusion became their very essence. He began to examine the hall walls, running his hands over the carved wood, the ornate wallpaper, looking for a crack, a lever, any indication of a secret passage. Legends told of old houses with hidden passages, escape routes. Perhaps the mansion, in its magical complexity, had something like that, a blind spot, a flaw. He tapped softly on the walls, listening to the hollow sound, the solid sound. Nothing. The mansion was perfect in its trap, no cracks, no apparent weaknesses. With each tap, each frustrated attempt, the image of his grandchildren sleeping soundly, warm and fed, contrasted painfully with his own despair. They were thriving. Their faces, once thin and pale, were gaining a healthy glow. Their laughter, once rare and restrained, now filled the corridors during the day. How could he explain to them that the paradise they lived in was, in fact, a slaughterhouse? How could he take them from a place that gave them everything they never had, to lead them back to uncertainty, to cold, to hunger? The mansion didn't just trap them. It bought them, one smile, one meal, one soft blanket at a time, making escape a betrayal in innocent eyes. The witch. She had given the seed. She knew. She was the architect of this gilded prison. What would she gain from it? Power? Or perhaps the witch was merely an intermediary, a servant of a greater force, the mansion itself. The idea that the witch was not the mastermind behind it all, but merely a tool, was even more terrifying. It meant the mansion was a primordial entity with an insatiable hunger, and the witch merely pointed out the victims. Ilara felt a shiver. The witch had said to plant the seed in the ruins. The ruins. What was in the ruins that made it the perfect place for planting? What secrets did they hold, beyond stones and memories? If the mansion's roots were in the ruins, perhaps there was something there that could be used against it. A weakness, ancient knowledge. But how to get to the ruins? The windows and doors were sealed. Ilara looked at the marble floor, smooth and polished. What if the way out wasn't through the walls, but through the floor? An underground passage. The idea was crazy, but desperation propelled him. He needed a tool, something that could dig clear a path. The mansion, so luxurious, seemed to have nothing that could serve such a purpose. Or did it? Did the mansion itself, in its complexity, hold the key to its own destruction? The early morning advanced, and with it, the urgency of his dilemma. His grandchildren would soon awaken, and with them, the need to maintain the facade, to hide the terror that consumed him. Ilara needed to act, and fast. The book, still in his hands, was a map to perdition, but perhaps also to salvation. He clutched it again, feeling the subtle hum emanating from it, a promise of knowledge and danger. The fight for his family's soul had become a race against time, and the battlefield was the very house that had saved them. He needed to find the tools to fight what seemed invincible before the harvest arrived. The icy panic that had momentarily paralyzed him gave way to a silent fury, an iron determination that burned in his chest. His grandchildren. The image of their sleeping faces, so serene and innocent, was a shield against total despair. Ilara could not yield, could not accept it. The mansion might be a parasite, a trap, but he would not be the prey. With the book still clutched to his chest, a weight that now felt like an amulet, he began his search. His eyes, previously clouded by terror, now scanned every detail of the hall with feverish intensity. The carved wooden walls, the ornate silk panels, the tapestries that told stories of forgotten times. Every element, once a marvel, was now a clue, a piece of a deadly puzzle. He ran his hands over the cold wood, feeling every grain, every imperfection. He tapped softly, listening to the hollow sound and the solid sound, searching for an anomaly, a crack, a secret that the mansion's perfection tried to hide. The piano melody, coming from the ballroom, persisted, a hypnotic lullaby that seemed to try to lull his mind, drag him into acceptance, but Ilara resisted. The music, once a comfort, was now a sweet poison, a reminder of that entity's subtle manipulation. His steps led him to the imposing black marble fireplace which dominated one of the hall walls. It was gigantic, with intricate carvings of mythical creatures and arcane symbols. He knelt, running his fingers over the cold stone, feeling the texture, looking for any sign of a mechanism, a hidden lever. The residual warmth of the last fire still lingered in the air, a cruel contrast to the chill that ran up his spine. Nothing. The fireplace seemed as solid and unshakable as the rest of the house. Ilara stood up, frustration growing, but not enough to crush his hope. He remembered legends of ancient houses, of secret passages that revealed themselves only to the most attentive eyes or the most desperate hearts. The mansion was magical, yes, but perhaps its magic had blind spots, flaws. His eyes fixed on a large pendulum clock, made of ebony and gold, resting in a dark corner. Its hands were stopped, frozen at some point in the past, but a soft, constant ticking seemed to echo from its depths, a sound that didn't come from the mechanism, but from the house itself. It was a sound he had never noticed before, an almost imperceptible pulse. He approached, feeling a strange attraction. As he touched the cold wood of the clock, Ilara felt a faint hum, a subtle vibration that seemed to resonate with the book in his hands. It was as if the clock was a point of convergence, a knot in the mansion's energy web. He examined the base, the sides, the top, and then his fingers brushed against something unusual. Behind one of the most elaborate carvings, hidden in the shadow, there was a small, almost imperceptible protrusion, With his heart pounding erratically, Ilara pressed it. A soft click, almost inaudible, resonated in the silence of the hall. There was no immediate movement, no secret door opening with a dramatic creak, just the click. He waited. Breath held, but nothing happened. Disappointment threatened to engulf him, but then he noticed. The clock's ticking had ceased. The silence that followed was not empty, but heavy, as if the mansion was holding its breath. Ilara took a step back, his eyes scanning the area around the clock. And there, on the marble floor, directly in front of the clock, a thin, almost invisible line began to delineate itself. It wasn't a crack, but a perfect fissure extending in a semicircle. Slowly, with an almost imperceptible groan, a section of the marble began to sink, revealing a dark staircase descending into the depths. The air rising from the opening was damp and heavy, with a smell of wet earth and mold, very different from the mansion's scent of wax and flowers. It was the smell of the ruins, the smell of the past, the smell of the mansion's heart. Ilara felt a shiver. The mansion had revealed a secret, but at what cost? Was it an even deeper trap, or a genuine chance for salvation? The piano melody had stopped completely, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow any sound. He looked into the darkness of the passage, then at the book in his hands. It seemed to vibrate with more intensity now, as if recognizing the path that was opening. The truth, cold and brutal, was there, waiting for him. But the darkness was dense, and Ilara had no light source. The mansion, so luxurious, seemed to offer nothing that could illuminate his way into the depths. His eyes scanned the hall again, searching for something, anything. And then he saw it. In the center of the oak coffee table, a solid silver candelabra with 7 untouched candles gleamed under the moonlight streaming through the sealed windows. 7 candles, 7 grandchildren. Was it a cruel coincidence or a warning from the mansion? With steady steps, Ilara approached the table. He picked up the candelabra, feeling the cold weight of the silver in his hands. There were no matches, no lighters. But the mansion, in its complexity, always seemed to offer what was needed, though with a hidden price. He remembered the fireplace. There were embers there, still warm, waiting. He rushed to the fireplace, lit one of the candles from the residual heat, and then used that flame to light the other 6. The 7 flames danced, casting long, distorted shadows across the hall, transforming the mansion's deceptive beauty into something even more sinister. The candelabra, now lit, was heavy, but its light was a beacon in the impending darkness. With the candelabra in one hand and the book in the other, Ilara turned to the newly revealed passage. The stone staircase, damp and slippery, spiraled down into the unknown. Each step seemed an invitation to the abyss, to the heart of the beast. He felt the weight of responsibility, the terror of what he might find down there. But the image of his grandchildren's sleeping faces was a fire that propelled him. The darkness swallowed Ilara with palpable veracity. The air, previously only damp and heavy, became icy and dense, laden with the unmistakable smell of wet earth, mold, and a subtle metallic note he couldn't identify. The candelabra, with its 7 dancing flames, was a fragile beacon, casting ghostly shadows that stretched and twisted on the rough stone walls. Each step was slippery, covered by a thin layer of slime, and the sound of his own footsteps echoed, amplified, as if he were descending into a tomb. The silence that enveloped him was different from the silence of the hall. It was not the absence of sound, but an oppressive stillness, as if time itself had stopped down there. The clock's ticking, which once seemed like the mansion's pulse, had ceased, and now he felt the pulse of something older, more primordial, beating within the very stone walls. The book in his hands vibrated with greater intensity, a constant hum that seemed to resonate with the depths of the earth. It was a guide, a warning, or perhaps a portal to the truth he sought. The staircase snaked downwards, seemingly endless, and Ilara felt the vertigo of the descent. His muscles protested, but the image of his grandchildren's sleeping faces was a balm for his weariness, a shield against the fear that threatened to paralyze him. He could not fail, could not give in. With each step, the temperature dropped, and the air grew heavier, almost difficult to breathe. The stone walls, once smooth, began to show signs of wear, of erosion, as if they had been sculpted not by human hands, but by the very passage of time. At certain points, thick, twisted roots, like veins of a sleeping giant, burst from the stone, descending with it. They were not roots of common trees, but of something older, deeper, that seemed to feed on the rock itself. Ilara touched one and felt a subtle vibration, a strange warmth that seemed to pulse in sync with the book in his hands. They were the mansion's roots, yes, but also the roots of the ruins, and perhaps the roots of something even more ancient. The descent seemed endless. Time lost all meaning, and Ilara didn't know if he had been there for minutes or hours. The candelabra's light, which once seemed strong, now struggled to penetrate the growing darkness, and the flames flickered, threatening to go out at any moment. He felt a chill. If he lost his light down there, he would be lost. Suddenly the staircase ended. Ilara stepped onto a packed dirt floor, damp and uneven. The space before him opened into a vast underground cavern whose limits were lost in the darkness beyond the reach of his candles. The smell of earth and mold was overwhelming, and the air was so still it felt heavy, almost solid. The cavern walls were of irregular stone, but at some points he could discern ancient masonry blocks, corroded by time, that blended with the natural rock. These were the ruins, but not the ruins he knew. They were the foundations, the pulsating heart of something much older than the mansion that had risen above them. In the center of the cavern, the faint light of the candelabra revealed an imposing structure. It was an altar, or perhaps a pedestal, carved from a dark, gleaming stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Upon it, there were no sacrifices or offerings, but something that made Ilara's blood run cold. It was a crack, a deep, irregular fissure in the stone, from which emanated a faint, almost imperceptible greenish glow, and from the crack a single root sprouted, thicker and more twisted than any he had seen, extending upwards, lost in the darkness of the cavern ceiling. This was the main root, the root of the seed, the root of the mansion. The book in his hands began to vibrate violently, and the hum intensified, almost painfully. Ilara felt a powerful force emanating from the crack, a primordial energy that seemed to pull him, draw him towards it. It was the essence of the mansion, the source of its magic, and perhaps the key to its destruction. But it was also the source of its power, and Ilara felt he was before something that defied human comprehension. He approached the altar, the candelabra's flames flickering wildly, as if the light itself was fighting against the darkness of that place. As he knelt, he could see that the crack was not natural. It seemed to have been made by an impact, a violent force that had broken the stone, and within the crack he saw something more. It wasn't just a greenish light, but a viscous, luminous substance that pulsed slowly, like a heart. And amidst this substance there were fragments of something that looked like glass or crystal, but that shone with their own light, a light that seemed familiar. With a shiver, Ilara realized, they were fragments of the seed, the magic seed the witch had given him. It hadn't simply grown, it had shattered, merged with that primordial energy and spread, its roots intertwining with the very essence of the earth. The witch hadn't given a seed to grow a house, but to awaken something that was already dormant, to feed an ancient entity with the promise of a new harvest. The truth, cold and brutal, revealed itself. The mansion was not just a house. It was a parasite, an ancient being that fed on something, and the seed was the catalyst, the link between the entity and the outside world. The witch, she knew, she was the intermediary, the servant. But whom or what did she serve? The mansion itself, or something even more sinister residing in the depths of that fissure? Ilara extended his hand, hesitant to touch the luminous substance. The book in his hands vibrated even harder, and a whispering voice, seeming to come from within the stone itself, echoed in his mind. They were not words, but feelings, hunger, desire, a promise of power, and a threat of annihilation. He withdrew his hand abruptly. That was not just the mansion's source, it was its soul, its mind, its hunger. And it was alive, and it was waiting. The candelabra's light, which once seemed a beacon, now seemed a target. Ilara felt a cold panic. He had found the mansion's heart, but not a weakness, only an overwhelming, ancient and hungry force. What would he do now? How to fight something that was the very earth, the very magic? The book, which once seemed an amulet, was now a weight, a burden that had led him to the abyss. He needed more, needed a weapon, knowledge that could combat this primordial force. His eyes swept the cavern, searching for something, anything, that could give him an advantage. And then, on the ancient masonry walls, mixed with the rock, he saw it. Symbols, carvings, writings in a language he had never seen, but which seemed familiar, like an echo of a forgotten dream. They were the legends of the ruins, the stories of what had been before the mansion, before the seed, and perhaps the instructions for its destruction. The revelation struck Ilara like an icy bolt, paralyzing him for an instant. The mansion was not a gift, but a trap. The seed was not a miracle, but a catalyst. The witch was not a benefactress, but a servant of something far older and more sinister. The mansion's heart pulsed there before him, a crack in the stone that bled greenish light and fragments of the seed, a hungry entity that fed on life itself. Panic threatened to consume him, but the image of his grandchildren's sleeping faces, so vulnerable upstairs, was a shield against despair. He could not yield. His eyes swept the cavern again, fixing on the symbols on the masonry walls. That was his only chance, a thread of hope amidst the abyss. With the flickering candelabra in one hand and the still vibrating book in the other, Ilara approached the wall, feeling the cold dampness of the stone against his skin. The carvings were deep, corroded by time, but still legible. They were not just symbols, but a tapestry of images and glyphs, a pictorial narrative of a forgotten era. The book in his hands began to vibrate with even greater intensity, a sharp hum that seemed to resonate with the symbols themselves. It was as if the volume was being turned up, the silent words of the stone gaining voice through the tome's magic. Ilara felt a strange connection, a bridge forming between his mind and the ancient wisdom engraved there. He ran his fingers over the carvings, and the images began to move in his mind like an old distorted film. He saw representations of an ancestral people living in harmony with the earth, but also fearing it. They venerated an underground entity, an earth spirit that granted them abundance in exchange for offerings. But the offerings changed from fruits and grains to something darker, more vital. The images showed human figures, kneeling, extending their hands towards a fissure in the earth, from which emanated the same greenish light that now pulsed on the altar. And then the images became more disturbing. Drawings of people wasting away, their forms becoming translucent, their lives being sucked into the earth. The entity was not a benevolent spirit. It was a primordial vampire, a parasite that fed on the vital force of the living. The mansion, he realized with a shiver that ran down his spine, was the culmination of this cycle. The magic seed was not to create a house, but to create a home for the entity, a place where it could attract and trap its harvests with the promise of comfort and security. The mansion was bait, a spider's web woven with magic and illusion. designed to slowly drain the life from its inhabitants, and his grandchildren, his precious grandchildren, were sleeping upstairs, unaware of the web that enveloped them. The images continued, revealing the story of that people's downfall. They tried to free themselves. There was a rebellion, a desperate ritual to seal the entity again. They used an artifact, a kind of crystal, to crack the stone and try to isolate the source of power, but the ritual failed, or perhaps not completely. The fissure in the altar, the crack Ilara had noticed, was the result of that confrontation. The fragments of the seed he had seen in the luminous substance were, in fact, the remains of that crystal, infused with the witch's magic, reactivating what had been sealed. The witch. Her role became painfully clear. She was not a willing servant, but perhaps a descendant of that people, or someone who had been deceived, or perhaps the entity itself had corrupted her. She had been the key to reactivating the parasite, to offer a new harvest to the dormant creature, and Ilara, in his desperate need, had been the perfect instrument. The book in his hands vibrated one last time, and then one of the symbols on the wall seemed to light up, not with physical light, but with a clarity in his mind. It was a complex glyph, surrounded by other, smaller symbols that looked like instructions. It was not a ritual to destroy the entity, but to weaken it, to seal it again. It required a sacrifice, yes, but not of life. It required an exchange, a bond, a renunciation. The mansion could not be destroyed without destroying the earth itself, but it could be put to sleep, its hunger temporarily sated, its connection to the outside world severed. The early morning advanced, and time was running out. Ilara felt the entity's presence intensify, a hungry whisper seeming to come from all directions. The air in the cavern grew heavier, and the main root, sprouting from the crack, seemed to pulse with stronger energy, like an accelerating heart. His grandchildren would soon awaken, and with each passing moment, the mansion rooted itself deeper into them, sucking their joy, their vitality, their very essence. He needed to act. The glyph on the wall was a map, a guide to salvation, but also to a personal sacrifice he didn't yet fully comprehend. The fight for his family's soul had become a race against time, and the battlefield was the very house that had saved them. He had found the beast's heart. He had found a way to put it to sleep. But the price? The price was still hidden in the shadows of that glyph, waiting to be revealed. Ilara clutched the book to his chest, feeling the weight of responsibility and the urgency of what needed to be done. He had no choice. He would do whatever it took. The glyph's revelation was a beacon in the darkness, but its light was cold, icy. Ilara understood that salvation demanded a price, and the word sacrifice echoed in his mind, devoid of the promise of death, yet laden with a loss that seemed equally devastating. An exchange, a bond, a renunciation. What would he have to give? What would the mansion or the entity inhabiting it consider a fair payment to put its hunger to sleep? The air in the cavern grew dense, heavy, as if the entity itself were awakening from its ancient slumber, sensing the imminent threat. The greenish light pulsing in the crack intensified, and the roots sprouting from it, previously still, now slowly writhed like hungry tentacles extending into the darkness. A guttural whisper, not a sound, but a vibration that resonated in his bones, filled the space, a primordial voice that seemed to say, "No, do not deny me the harvest." Ilara clutched the book to his chest, feeling its vibration become a constant tremor, like a frightened heart. His eyes, previously fixed on the glyph, now swept the cavern, searching for the elements the instructions seemed to require. There were no exotic ingredients or complex black magic rituals. The solution seemed more intimate, more personal. The glyph did not ask for blood, but for the essence of something. He ran his fingers over the smaller symbols surrounding the main glyph. They were representations of everyday objects, yet imbued with meaning. A piece of fabric, a strand of hair, a drop of dew, the flame of a candle. They were not mere items, but links, connections to life, to hope, to existence itself. And the most prominent of them, what seemed to be the core of the renunciation, was the image of a house. But not just any house. It was the mansion, in its most glorious, vibrant, life-filled form. A chill ran through Ilara. The renunciation was not of an object, but of the dream, of the miracle that had saved him, of the promise of security and comfort that the mansion represented. To seal the entity, he would have to sever the emotional bond with the house, strip it of its power of attraction, of its illusion. He would have to wish that the mansion didn't exist, that it would return to ruins, that the present had never happened. It was a renunciation of his own hope, of his own salvation. Panic threatened to suffocate him again. Giving up the mansion meant returning to square one, to poverty, to eviction, to uncertainty. But his grandchildren, they were upstairs, sleeping, slowly being drained. The mansion was a gilded cage, and he was the only one who could free them. With an iron determination, Ilara began to act. The glyph showed that the exchange required a personal bond with the house, something that connected him directly to its magic. He looked at the candelabra in his hand. The light, the warmth, the flame. It was a symbol of home, of life. It was a bond. He approached the pulsing crack, feeling the damp warmth and raw energy emanating from it. The greenish substance seemed to extend, almost touching his fingers. The book vibrated frantically, and the silent words of the glyph became clearer in his mind. The first step was to establish the exchange. He needed to offer a piece of himself, not to be consumed, but to be the channel, the link. The glyph showed an outstretched hand with a small personal object. Ilara took his wedding ring from his finger, the only treasure he had left from his husband, a symbol of love, of family, of a happy past. It was the strongest bond he possessed with the life he had built, and which the mansion had promised to restore. With a trembling sigh, he placed the ring in his palm and extended it towards the crack. The instant the metal touched the edge of the stone, the greenish light intensified, swallowing the ring. There was no suction, no pain, just a silent absorption, as if the stone itself had accepted it. A bond had been established. The second step was renunciation. The glyph showed the image of the mansion dissolving, not into ruins, but into mist, into memory. He needed to verbalize the desire, not just feel it, needed to sever the tie that bound him to the illusion, to the promise. Ilara closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The guttural voice of the entity became more audible, a low growl that seemed to come from within the earth. "No, you cannot. You belong to me. Your children belong to me." Ignoring the terror, Ilara opened his eyes and looked at the crack, at the mansion's hungry heart. His voice, though trembling, carried a strength he didn't know he possessed. "I renounce this house," he declared, and the cavern seemed to tremble. "I renounce its promise, its illusion, its false security. May you return to dust. May your magic dissipate. May your hunger sleep." With each word, the greenish light pulsed more violently, and the roots writhed as if in agony. The book in his hands grew hot, almost burning his skin. The entity was resisting, fighting against his will. "I sever the bond that connects me to you," Ilara continued, feeling a sharp pain in his chest, as if tearing something within himself. It was the pain of abandoning hope, of accepting the harsh reality. "May you no longer be a home, but a tomb for your own hunger." The moment the last words left his lips, the cavern was engulfed by a silent scream, a primordial lament that made the ground tremble beneath his feet. The greenish light exploded in a blinding flash, and Ilara was thrown backward, hitting the stone wall hard. The candelabra fell from his hand, and the flame went out, plunging the cavern into almost total darkness, broken only by the residual and now weakened glow from the crack. The book was still in his hands, vibrating, but with a different intensity, as if exhausted. Ilara felt an overwhelming weakness, as if years had been sucked from him in a single instant. The renunciation had been more than words. It had been a draining of his own vitality, of his own faith. He dragged himself back to the crack, his body aching, his mind in shock. The greenish light still pulsed, but it was weaker, more opaque. The roots had stopped writhing, and the viscous substance seemed to be retracting, like a being shrinking into deep sleep. The entity had not been destroyed, but was dormant, sealed again, its hunger temporarily sated by the exchange and the renunciation. But the cost. Ilara felt the emptiness in his chest, the absence of that hope the mansion had ignited. He had saved his grandchildren, but at what price? The mansion was still standing. He could feel its presence above him, but now it was just a structure, stripped of its seductive magic, of its illusion of comfort. It was an empty cocoon, a shell. The early morning was almost over. The first rays of sun would soon touch the mansion's windows. His grandchildren would wake up, and he needed to be there for them. But how? How would he explain the emptiness he felt, the absence of the magic that had saved them? How would he protect them now, without the mansion's promise? Ilara stood up, staggering, the book still clutched in his hands. The fight for his family's soul had reached a climax, and he had won. But the victory was bitter. He had put the beast to sleep, but had lost a part of himself in the process. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the mansion would never be the same, nor would he. The darkness in the cavern was almost absolute, dense and cold, a brutal contrast to the blinding flash that had just engulfed Ilara. His body ached, every muscle protesting against the impact, but the physical pain was a mere echo before the emptiness that now opened in his chest. The greenish light from the crack, once a beacon of danger and power, now flickered weakly like a dying ember. The roots, once hungry tentacles, were motionless, retracted, as if the earth itself had pulled a blanket over a deep, exhausted sleep. The entity was dormant, sealed, but at what cost? Ilara dragged himself, hands trembling, in search of the candelabra. His fingers brushed against the cold metal, and he lifted it, the flickering flame struggling to illuminate the damp darkness. The book, his guide and his burden, was still clutched in his other hand, now cold and heavy, like a tome of bitter truths. He felt like an empty shell, his vital energy drained, the hope the mansion had ignited, now cold ash in his soul. The renunciation had been not just of a house, but of an imagined future, of a promise of security that deep down he knew was too good to be true. The climb back up through the underground corridors was an ordeal. Each step was a monumental effort, each breath a reminder of the exhaustion that consumed him. The cavern air seemed to have seeped into his bones, a cold that was not just temperature, but the absence of warmth, of life. When he finally emerged into the mansion's basement, the air upstairs, though still heavy, felt lighter, less oppressive. But the most striking change was not in the air, but in the house itself. The mansion was silent, not the silence of night, but a deep, unnatural silence, as if the heart that pulsed it had stopped. The seductive magic, the welcoming glow, the illusion of life that permeated every corner, all had vanished. It was as if the colors had faded, the sound muffled, the scent of home replaced by a neutral, forgotten aroma. The walls, once vibrant with an almost palpable energy, now seemed merely walls of stone and wood, cold and indifferent. The mansion was an empty cocoon, an imposing structure, but stripped of its soul, of its essence. Ilara climbed the stairs, each creak beneath his feet sounding like a lament in the house's stillness. The sun began to peek through the windows, casting pale rays over the luxurious furniture, which now seemed merely expensive, not magical. There was no longer the comforting warmth radiating from the carpets, nor the inviting sparkle of the chandeliers. The mansion was a museum of itself, a memory of something that had been but was no more. He reached the bedroom floor. The silence was broken only by the soft breathing of his grandchildren, who slept soundly. Ilara approached the first bedroom, his heart heavy. They were safe. The threat had been contained. But the price was visible in his own reflection in the mirror. Sunken eyes, pale skin, an expression of weariness that seemed to have aged him by years, and the emptiness in his chest, a dull ache that would accompany him. The first rays of sun touched the windows, and with them the first signs of awakening. A yawn, a small murmur. Ilara rushed to the main bedroom where the youngest ones slept. He needed to be there, for them, for the moment they opened their eyes to this new, stripped-down reality. When the first grandson opened his eyes, a small smile appeared on his lips, but quickly faded. He looked around the room, at the toys the mansion had magically provided, and an air of confusion clouded his face. There was no longer the effervescent joy of before, the sense of wonder. It was as if the spell had been broken, the illusion revealed. "Grandpa?" he asked, his voice sleepy but with a tone of strangeness. "The house, it's different." Ilara felt a pang in his heart. They felt it. They felt the absence of magic, the loss of that invisible warmth that enveloped them. The entity had been sealed, but the connection to the mansion, which had rooted itself in them, had left a mark. It was not a mark of illness, but of a subtle loss, an emptiness they could not name. The other grandchildren began to awaken, and the same confusion, the same lack of sparkle in their eyes was evident in each of them. They looked at the luxurious rooms, at the toys, at the food that would soon appear on the table, but without the same enthusiasm. The mansion, for them, had lost its glow, its soul. It was just a big house now. Ilara sat on the edge of the bed, hugging the grandson who had spoken. "It's all right, my love," he whispered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "The house, it's just a little tired, just like Grandpa." The lie was fragile but necessary. How could he explain to them the hungry entity, the sacrifice, the renunciation? How could he tell them that the house that had saved them was, in fact, a gilded cage? The mansion still stood, a silent monument to his victory and his loss. They still had a roof over their heads, soft beds and food on the table, but the magic that had pulled them from misery, the promise of a life without worries, had been exchanged for a bitter peace. Ilara had put the beast to sleep, but had woken to a new reality, one as uncertain as the one they had left behind. The fight for his family's soul had reached a climax, but the true battle, that of rebuilding hope and finding a new path, was only just beginning. He had saved his grandchildren, but now he needed to save them from a different kind of emptiness, and himself from the shadow of renunciation. The mansion was now just a home, and Ilara, an exhausted but determined grandfather, knew he would have to fill it with something stronger than magic. The love and resilience of his own family. Morning advanced, and with it the harsh reality set in. The grandchildren's murmurs grew more frequent, their questions more direct. "Grandpa, why isn't the food as tasty today? Grandpa, why don't the toys shine anymore?" Ilara felt each question like a stab to his already exhausted heart. The lie that the house was tired was fragile, and their little hearts, so accustomed to wonder, perceived the absence of enchantment. They didn't understand the renunciation, the sacrifice, the silent battle he had fought in the depths. They only felt the loss of something intangible, yet real. Ilara hugged them, one by one, trying to fill the emptiness with his own warmth. He fed them with what the mansion still provided: bread, fruit, milk. But the taste of magic had faded, leaving only the simple, honest taste of food. There was no longer the surprise of a favorite dish magically appearing, nor the gleam of self-cleaning silverware. The house was now a structure, a shelter, but stripped of the soul that had made it a paradise. He spent his mornings organizing, cleaning, cooking, tasks that were once unnecessary. The book, his guide, and now his burden, remained on his bedside table, a constant reminder of what had happened. He would sometimes leaf through it, perhaps seeking a clue, some wisdom that could fill the emptiness. But the words now seemed merely letters, stripped of their mystical power. It was a book of ancient stories, not a magic manual. The grandchildren, with the resilience inherent in childhood, began to find new ways to play. Without magic to entertain them, they turned to each other and to Ilara himself. Games of hide-and-seek in the vast corridors, reading stories by candelabra light, building forts with blankets in the luxurious rooms. All of this filled the silence of the house with a new kind of life, one that came from within, not from without. Ilara watched them, a melancholic smile on his lips. They were learning to create their own magic, the magic of imagination, of camaraderie, of family love. He realized that the witch, in her enigmatic wisdom, perhaps had never promised a life of infinite magical ease. Perhaps the seed was not just to build a house, but to plant the seed of self-sufficiency and true happiness in their hearts. The mansion was a gift, yes, but also a test of his ability to see beyond the sparkle, to find the real value in things. One afternoon, as the setting sun painted the halls with melancholic golden hues, Ilara sat in the grand living room, the book on his lap. His grandchildren played in the garden, their laughter echoing through the house, a sound that would once have been muffled by the entity's energy, but which now filled every corner with a pure, unpretentious joy. He looked at the walls, at the sumptuous furniture, at the windows that framed the landscape. The mansion was still imposing, but it was no longer a gilded prison. It was a home they would have to care for, that they would have to fill with their own lives. The emptiness in his chest had not completely disappeared, but it was diminishing, slowly being filled by the warmth of his grandchildren's laughter, by the certainty that they were safe, and by the new understanding that true home was not made of magic, but of love. The renunciation had been painful, but necessary. He had lost the illusion, but had gained the truth. Life in the mansion, now stripped of its supernatural charm, was a life of work and challenges, but also of a peace that magic could never have offered. Ilara, the evicted grandfather, had found a home for his 7 children. Not a magical home, but a real home, built on the foundation of his own sacrifice and his family's resilience. The mansion was a monument to his journey, a constant reminder that the greatest magic of all resided not in spells or enchanted seeds, but in the unwavering strength of a maternal heart, in the ability to fight, to renounce, and above all, to love. And as the sun set, casting long shadows over the house, Ilara smiled. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was not alone. He had his grandchildren, and they had each other. And that, he knew, was more than enough. The true story of the mansion was not about the magic that created it, but about the love that transformed it into a home.